This is the Blood Red Podcast from the Liverpool Echo.
Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the Blood Red Podcast from the Liverpool Echo. I'm Matt Addison with Paul Gorst, Rimmer and Theo Squires alongside me for this one. After Gini Wijnaldum gave Liverpool fans another reminder of what they'll be missing from next season onwards over the weekend, we'll be taking a look at what might come next for Liverpool in terms of their transfer plans and a possible replacement. Gini Wijnaldum, Gorsty, has gone to PSG. We've known that for a little while now, but I think it's probably going to take Reds fans a little bit of time to get over that one.
I think so, yeah. Just watching him last night playing for Holland, captaining them, leading them on. Thought he was fantastic, and he obviously plays a different role, doesn't he, for the national team. He's encouraged to get forward a lot more and try and get into the box, and you can see that straight away. You know, if you haven't watched the Netherlands too often over the last couple of years, and now you kind of tuning in to see Wijnaldum in a different role, that this is what he's all about. You know, within 2 minutes, or within the first minute, he was inside the box and he was laying on a great chance for Denzel Dumfries, and then he had another shot that was well saved, and then popped up with a great finish in the second half. And he's very much a box-to-box midfielder with a bit of an onus on getting into that box and scoring goals. And Liverpool fans probably looking at it thinking, where's this player been for the last 5 years? It's obviously completely different to how he operates at Liverpool, where it's very much, you know, safety first, covering the full-backs and making sure that Liverpool aren't susceptible to counter-attacks, shielding the ball and trying to put the front men in as quickly as possible. So, yeah, it's a different role, but it's you know, he's one of those players who's so intelligent and so, you know, got so much of a skill set that he can do several different types of jobs, and that goes beyond just playing in centre midfield, doesn't it? You know, we've seen him at Liverpool where Jurgen Klopp played him in a back three and played him up front against Barcelona in the Champions League semi-final. He's just a superb player, an incredible athlete, and it's one that Liverpool are going to miss. Liverpool losing a 30-year-old midfielder at the prime of his career, and he's not taking a step down, is he? There's not too many players who leave Liverpool and go to a club of similar stature in Europe, but you know, this is definitely one of them, isn't it? PSG, and it's disappointing really, because I think almost to a man Liverpool supporters wanted to keep hold of him, and there he goes off to PSG as a free agent, and Liverpool can't even get any money for him.
I think lots of Liverpool fans watching Onjo last night were kind of joking on Twitter saying, oh, Liverpool should have a look at this Gini Wijnaldum to maybe replace Gini Wijnaldum. I mean, it is a big hole to fill, isn't it?
Massively, yeah. I mean, not least because he was always available, and I think one of Liverpool's issues in recent years, well, in last year, sorry, has been injuries, and Gini Wijnaldum was always so reliable. He was never present. He could, as Gorsty's just mentioned, play in a number of positions, and you know, Liverpool didn't even play him in the position that perhaps he catches the eye most, that he does for the Netherlands. So, you know, I think it will be a difficult one. I'm pretty certain this isn't something that Jurgen Klopp wanted. You know, I think it's one of those things that, you know, kind of went above Klopp's head, I'm sure, on this occasion, and Liverpool are going to have to find a way of replacing him. And all the noises that they don't want a midfielder, or they're perhaps not prioritising midfield. But I think as push comes to shove, I'm pretty sure Klopp will want an extra body in there just to protect you against what happened in the central defence last season. And it's a difficult one, isn't it? You know, I think I looked watching the game last night, and Theo's done a piece just now about Wijnaldum. I think he's spot on. I think between the Netherlands and PSG, I think they could really show a different side to Wijnaldum that we didn't really see at Liverpool. And he's one of those players that all Liverpool fans know his value, but perhaps the wider football world don't really see his value as much. I don't think any, you know, sort of some lovely birds singing there, Theo in the background. I don't think the wider football world will probably think, oh, it's a big blow for Liverpool. I think they will just feel like, well, what did they actually do? But, you know, I think the Netherlands and PSG will show you a different side of him. And, you know, I think as the season goes on, we could be talking more and more about the mistake Liverpool have made because of his performances. He's the type of player that, like, say, you know, I always think of Didi Hamann when I think of players like this, as a player who Liverpool fans who watched them week after week knew how good they were, but perhaps the wider football world didn't appreciate. But Wijnaldum was a great player for Liverpool, great servant, a massive part of what they've done in the recent years. And Liverpool will massively miss him.
The goal for Holland as well, Theo, I mean, it's nothing new. He seemed to do that every single time he went away on international duty. And it always felt a bit weird that we didn't see that side of him for Liverpool. But I suppose it just, again, underlines the versatility, the fact that he's so intelligent as a footballer. He can just do pretty much every role there is going.
Yeah, it's one that Jurgen Klopp addressed, didn't he, after the Crystal Palace game, saying that when he started in the Netherlands, he was this number 10. He went to Newcastle, he's a left winger, and he's done all this stuff. And then he came to Liverpool and he just became this controlling midfielder. And it's a testament to his ability that he was capable of doing all these roles. And it wasn't a case of, it's a number 10 playing out of position. He looked competent. He looked like he was doing a solid job in all of them. And you think the role he plays for the Netherlands, where he's scoring all these goals, that position hasn't existed in the Liverpool side since Philippe Coutinho left, really. And Liverpool haven't needed it as such, because that's not where they get the goals. The front three get the goals, the fullbacks get the assists, and the midfield is just there as this engine room that runs, covers every blade of grass, wins the ball back, doing all the high pressing. So they're not really needed to see this goal-scoring midfielder that was Gini Wijnaldum. But it was comforting, I suppose, that Liverpool knew that they could use him in that role if it ever came to it. If they ever had an injury crisis and they needed a goal, you could put Wijnaldum in this attacking role and you could rely on him, because he did step up when he needed and he did get big goals. You think of Barcelona, that will never be forgotten. Middlesbrough, Jurgen Klopp name dropped the Cardiff goal he scored when he just missed out on the title. And you look, he scored against the likes of Everton, Arsenal, Man City, Tottenham, Chelsea. He was always there when Liverpool needed him. And it's one where you are going to miss that. He's such a quality player, but you go and put him in this role now where he can play as a number 10 and he scores so many. Like his record for the Netherlands over the past 3 years is outstanding. I think he's contributing a goal just short of every game. You wouldn't expect that when you've seen him play for Liverpool, and it just shows how versatile he is. But you've got to give credit to his character as well, because how many times have you seen a player get the bottomless bout or sulk because they've not been able to do this attacking role? They've not been able to be the hero and get all the goals. The fact that he never once complained and he was just happy to do his job for his side and always contributing, he will be a big miss for Liverpool, and it will be one that will sting slightly more now if he does go to PSG and he is let off the leash, so to speak, and he can just go and be this number 10 scoring goals left, right and centre for them.
There's no doubt, Gorsty, in terms of a player, that Wijnaldum is going to be a big miss. But is it too early to say that Liverpool have made a mistake? I mean, surely Liverpool are too clever, too intelligent in the transfer market to have done this without having a plan to replace him or find a way of moving on without him.
Yeah, generally Liverpool's record in the market deserves faith and trust, doesn't it, from supporters? But I think you've only got to look back, less than 12 months when Dejan Lovren was allowed to leave for Zenit St. Petersburg and no one came in to replace him, and look how much that bit Liverpool on the backside last season. If he would have been there, Liverpool wouldn't have had anywhere near as much trouble kind of fielding, a fairly respectable couple of centre-backs now and again. So while the general record of the last 5 years or so, certainly since Michael Edwards has come into the sporting director role and he's worked alongside Klopp and everyone else, it deserves a lot of respect and trust and faith. But there is kind of previous for saying that they've got things wrong. And I just think for the amount of games that Wijnaldum played last year, he played 51 times, and if Henderson and Thiago might have been fit at various junctures, and if Fabinho didn't spend 2/3 of the season at centre-back, then Wijnaldum may not have played quite as often as that. But to kind of just discard that durability and availability, quality, everything you want to say about him without thinking that you might need someone else is a bit naive, I think. Obviously, Liverpool have still got other central midfielders who didn't play anywhere near as much, someone like Naby Keita, for example, or Alex Oxlade-Chamberlain, but at no stage have they proven an ability to play 30 games a season. Obviously, they both had their injury problems, and I think if there is a genuine thought process that Liverpool think they can get by without a Wijnaldum replacement, I think it's pretty ballsy of them. And I think, I hope I'm wrong, but I think we can be looking at this as another rare mistake in the market.
I think I know the answer to this, Joe, but we are told that midfield is possibly not a priority for Liverpool this summer. But do they need a Wijnaldum replacement? As Gorsty said, he just plays so many matches. It would almost be naive. At best, it would be a massive gamble to not bring somebody in, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that's it. You've nailed it there. It's a massive gamble. And I think we saw Liverpool take a gamble last summer on centre-halves, and they said, we've got 3 and we can use Fabinho there. And look, it wasn't extraordinary circumstances. You don't expect that to happen every season, but it immediately backfired on them, didn't it? So, if I'm making decisions at Liverpool, I might think twice about taking gambles like that again. And look, we're not privy to, the ins and outs of these transfers. There might have been a lot said behind closed doors. There might have been genuine efforts to come to an agreement with Wijnaldum's representatives that just didn't come off. And, it's the same when they're planning ahead for centre-halves. Let's say they've been monitoring a Konate. Did you just sign anyone last summer to get by? Well, they had to do that in the end anyway, didn't they, in January, because they were so behind at centre-half. So, yeah, I just think it's too big a gamble. And I think after what Liverpool went through last season, you don't want to have such a struggle again. And, I agree with Gorsty. I think Thiago, Henderson and Fabinho all been fit and available for selection in the centre of the park. I think that probably would have been Liverpool's first choice 3 in midfield last season. But they weren't, and the fact remains that Wijnaldum was available for pretty much every game. So I just think Liverpool needs some fresh legs there. And also I think it's not just Wijnaldum, it's players like Keita and Oxlade-Chamberlain who haven't done it. Curtis Jones is still very early in his career, and neither of those 2 players have done enough, I think, at Liverpool to say, okay, we'll go into next season and rely on them. They've both had injury problems, but they've both had problems with form. So, I think we've spoke a lot about the transfers Liverpool need. I think that they need players. They've already got a centre-half, but they need players right through the spine of the team. And, I think midfield is one of those areas where you now try and buy someone who's around for the next 6 or 7 years. So, yeah, I think some of the links make sense. I'm sure we'll come on to them.
I disagree slightly. I disagree slightly here with whether they actually need one, because it's one where if you look at the availability of players, yes, sure, they do need another body in there. But that's in a season where Thiago's missed a chunk, Henderson's missed a chunk, Oxlade-Chamberlain, Keita, even James Milner, who we've not mentioned yet. Liverpool have got enough bodies there, even without Gini Wijnaldum. The gamble isn't whether they replace Wijnaldum, it's whether you rely on Keita and Oxlade-Chamberlain to get you through another season. Like, if we look back at the centre-backs, 3 centre-backs for a whole season was naive. That was a gamble. That isn't enough options to keep you going. But when you've got all the midfield options, the bodies are there. They will be covered. It isn't a case of whether Liverpool need to replace Gini Wijnaldum. It's a case of the long-term investment, whether they do bin off Naby Keita, whether they need a long-term replacement for James Milner, whether they need it for Jordan Henderson. But then you've still got, Roberto Firmino. He could play in midfield if they wanted to, 4-2-3-1. Xherdan Shaqiri, if he's still around, he can play in there. Takumi Minamino. They could even put Trent there. They've got enough options. It's just whether you rely on players to stay fit and what formation Jurgen Klopp wants to do, because there is that big drop-off now of Liverpool's starting 11 and the second string.
Is it more a case then, Theo, that Liverpool could use this as a bit of an opportunity to maybe bring in someone who's slightly different to Wijnaldum? Maybe if we say that they do have to get enough bodies, but it doesn't have to be like for like. Is there an opportunity to sort of do something a little bit different maybe in that midfield area?
Yeah, I'd imagine so. If they wanted to target a player, you don't want to go like for like. You'd want someone who can offer more to the side, because whilst Wijnaldum we know is versatile, Liverpool still were quite restrained with how they used him in that number 6 or number 8. It wasn't a case of when there were players missing in the front 3, Liverpool would put him in the front 3. You just need that difference, I suppose, so it can bring something new. Like Thiago Alcantara, he was signed because he was completely different to anything Liverpool had. And you're looking at, Curtis Jones can sort of do that Wijnaldum role of bringing it forward. Oxlade-Chamberlain and Keita can offer that when they're actually fit. So Liverpool do need more of that box-to-box option, because if you look back at last season, it was Henderson was the man that they really struggled to replace when he was out injured, the one who could be leading from the front, be a real captain in that middle of the park. It's just one of those where they need to look at the options they've got. They've got a lot of players that can get forward in midfield. It is someone now that is a bit more restrained, that can sit alongside Fabinho to offer that security, but get forward when they need him.
Let's go through a few possible replacements then. We'll start with Kalvin Phillips. We'll talk about Youri Tielemans and Florian Neuhaus as well a little bit later. But feel free to throw any other names into the mix as well as we go along. But Gorsty, I'll come to you first on Kalvin Phillips. I thought he was exceptional for England yesterday. Is that a player that you think could appeal to Liverpool in any sort of way?
Yeah, well, he'd be used to playing in a high energy midfield, wouldn't he? Playing for Marcelo Bielsa, they're probably one of the hardest working teams in the Premier League, alongside Liverpool and possibly one or two others. So I don't think that'd be too much of an adjustment. But I think playing in a Jurgen Klopp midfield is probably one of the most difficult jobs in world football, isn't it? You've got to have everything. You've got to have the quality to be able to play for the standards that are demanded generally of Liverpool Football Club, but then also to have the energy to get about the pitch, to press from the front, you're covering for the fullbacks as well, aren't you? Because Liverpool pretty much on the front foot all the time and playing with the front five, so you've got to fill in midfield and a fullback as well. So it's a difficult job to do, and I think that's why Klopp loved Wijnaldum so much, because he was so good at doing that essentially, and sometimes it goes a little bit under the radar and a bit unnoticed if it's not particularly flashy, but that's why Wijnaldum is so trusted. So I think finding someone who Klopp's going to think can do a similar job is going to be very difficult to do across Europe. Now, Kalvin Phillips, one season in the Premier League, don't get me wrong, he was excellent for Leeds throughout all of last season, wasn't he? And he was good again yesterday for England against Croatia. I'm not sure yet. I think if Liverpool were looking at Phillips, I think they'd possibly want him to have another season in the Premier League at Leeds, a club who Liverpool will feel confident of being able to get the man, if it does come to it. So I think if Liverpool are looking at Kalvin Phillips, I think they might give it at least another 12 months.
Yeah, certainly if they are looking at him, it won't just be off the back of one performance for England, Joe. I mean, what did you make of him yesterday? I thought that was definitely the best that I've seen him play before. But as Gorsty says, he has had a pretty good season for Leeds.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say the same, really. I thought that was the best I've seen him. Perhaps it's the most, if this makes sense, it's the most I've watched him. I've seen Leeds play this year, but I've not exactly sat there and gone, what can Kalvin Phillips do? So, but there's been a lot said about him. He does play, like Gorsty said, he plays in a similar sort of high pressure system, doesn't he? And he does seem the type of player just on the surface that would fit in at Liverpool. But I mean, my thing about Kalvin Phillips, and I think this about, people talk about Tielemans, I'm sure we'll come to him. But I just think those players are kind of past the point of Liverpool trying to sign them. I think they're not like a Van Dijk or an Addison who are at such a level where Liverpool will go, okay, we'll break our sort of structure and go out and buy them. I think they're not world class, but I also think that they'd be too expensive for Liverpool to go out and buy. I don't think Liverpool are going to spend 50, 60 million on a Kalvin Phillips or a Youri Tielemans. I just can't see it happening. I think Liverpool are more likely, you just mentioned his name before, Neuhaus.
That's how I'm going for.
Butchering that. But a player like that I think makes more sense, a little bit cheaper, somebody who, Liverpool can get to that level, if you like. So that's my thing. These Premier League players, I think, make a lot of sense, but they probably make a lot of sense because we watch them a lot. And, we sort of put two and two together. But I think Liverpool will probably be casting the net a little bit wider.
Theo, I know you were at Wembley yesterday to see him play. You've written something off the back of that. I know you were mightily impressed by him, but it wasn't actually a Wijnaldum replacement that you saw in him, possibly a replacement long-term for one of Liverpool's other midfielders.
Yeah, exactly that. I think when you've seen him for Leeds United, he's been this number 6 in front of a back four, and you've sort of overlooked his quality there because Leeds have got other players that can get forward and attack, and he's the one who just keeps it all together defensively. This one where yesterday we saw him as a real number 8, like pressing from the front. He looked like a Jurgen Klopp player. He looked like Jordan Henderson. Like, you think those years where he was playing number 6 and then he went back into a number 8, you took it for granted how good he really was. The fact that he could easily do both roles. And for Leeds, he has been a leader this season. Liverpool have been linked with him in the past, I think, when he was in the Championship. But that's when you're looking at him as a number 6. It's like, well, Liverpool aren't going to spend 40 million on a player to warm the bench behind Fabinho. But now when he's got that versatility to him, I think there was one moment yesterday, it was after he'd had his volley, when he was pressing, and he absolutely clattered one of the Croatian players on the edge of their own box. It's a challenge he probably gets away with in the Premier League. It's like, well, this is what Klopp wants from his midfielders, trying to win the ball back so high. And he set up the winning goal for Sterling, and he was offering so much more than we've seen from him in a Leeds side. It's like, well, maybe he could be one of those bodies in the Liverpool side. Granted, you wouldn't expect him to be the first choice ahead of a Thiago or anything like that. But he's 25? His best years are still ahead of him. He's going to have 3-4 years at the top before he really hits his peak. And it's one where it comes into the balance of, 3-4 years' time, Henderson's probably been restricted to the James Milner role in the squad, because there is going to be a change in the guard in this Liverpool midfield in a few years. When you look at the ages of Henderson and Thiago, you think, well, that's why Wijnaldum's gone. Kalvin Phillips could fit the bill, but he's English now and he's played in the Premier League. He's had a good game at the Euros. If he ends up having a good tournament and cements his place in this Gareth Southgate squad, that value is just going to go up and up. And it's whether Liverpool really decide he is the player to go and spend big on. When the time comes for them to actually have the money to go and make such a signing, there'll probably be other players out there a bit younger. But at the moment, when you think of the players that tick Liverpool's boxes, he certainly fits the bill. Like the fact that Liverpool spent half a season struggling to replace Jordan Henderson, and in one afternoon, Gareth Southgate has silenced any doubts about needing Henderson fit because you can just put Kalvin Phillips there. Definitely gives you something to consider.
I suppose that the big sticking point, Gorsty, is that valuation, isn't it? As Theo and Joe have both said there, it's almost like they would ask for such a huge offer to let the player go. It almost seems a little bit unrealistic. I suppose it's a little bit like Rafinha as well. He might be a player that suits Liverpool, but Leeds don't need to sell, and especially after a good Euros, of course, as well, that the price would just inflate even more.
It will, yeah. It's the Premier League premium, isn't it? It's always been the case, really, of clubs paying more when they're buying from the Premier League. So to that point, I can see what Joe means when he thinks Liverpool are going to be paying 60 million plus for Kalvin Phillips after 1 year in the Premier League. I'm not too sure. I do think that the Neuhaus situation seems to be something that's a little bit more realistic and obtainable for Liverpool. Obviously, a player who Klopp will know from keeping an eye on the Bundesliga a lot closely than probably we do, or certainly we do. But yeah, I mean, it just to me, I mean, from what you were told and so on, is that Liverpool aren't necessarily prioritising a central midfielder, but that doesn't mean that there's no chance of anyone coming in. So I just find it hard to believe that Liverpool aren't looking at a centre midfielder and thinking we need someone to come in and replace someone who just played 51 times in midfield. I really do. Obviously, we know the contracts are very much the order of the day once Liverpool return to pre-season next month. Addison and Fabinho, and then one or two others, Salah, Trent, Robertson, Van Dijk is obviously a big one as well. But Liverpool will have more irons in the fire than just let's try and box a handful of contracts. They have to be continuing to look at the squad, and they don't want to get to a point where Liverpool have got one of the highest wage bills in football on one of the older squads. So it's going to have to be like a constant kind of year of replenishments. It doesn't have to be overhauls. Not talking about 6 or 7 new arrivals and 8 or 9 out the door, but it's going to have to be like last summer when Thiago come in and Jota come in. Jota more pertinently at his age. Liverpool are going to have to continue to kind of evolve this squad, and a centre midfielder around about the age of 23, 24, for me would be something that maybe Liverpool should be looking at this summer.
I think for me, Joe, Youri Tielemans would be an absolutely ideal player to bring in to replace Wijnaldum, but very similar to Kalvin Phillips. You look at the price tag, it's going to be, 60, 70 million? What did they get for Harry Maguire? About 80 million pounds in the end. I mean, it's just one of those where, again, it just seems like it would just take such an astronomical offer. It's highly unlikely to happen, isn't it?
Yeah, that's my view. Yeah, I agree. I really like Youri Tielemans. I think he's full of energy. He's young. He's got space to improve. He's he's confident, he's bold. I like he scores goals, doesn't he? So there's a lot to like about him. But yeah, I think when you're trying to do business with a Premier League rival, there's going to be an extra fee on top of that. And Leicester have done well in recent years, so they're not going to want to let go of a player on the cheap. So it just to me, that makes Liverpool's life quite difficult. And that's why I think Liverpool will instead try and get in there first for a player who can become like Tielemans, perhaps in 1 or 2 seasons. And Gorsty makes a good point. I think it's about, for me now, they've done it with Konate. He's a young player, but one with a very high ceiling. It's the same now with a centre midfielder and another attacker. I think it's just about buying those players that offer something extra in the squad, but also bring that age down. And perhaps eventually you can start moving in and having a more permanent place in the starting lineup. So, it's sort of twofold for Liverpool this summer. Yeah, getting those squad players that Liverpool have desperately needed last season, but also just bringing that age down and making sure that going forward they have players, like a Tielemans that other people would love to buy. So, yeah, I don't see them going after Tielemans because I just think he's going to be too expensive. So, yeah, he's a good player though. I really like him.
And just before we move on to Neuhaus then, Theo, in terms of the 2 players we've discussed so far, one big box that they would tick is that they've already played in the Premier League. Do you think that's at all important to Liverpool? Would that help in terms of making a player maybe slightly more attractive than somebody who would have to come in and adjust a little bit?
It depends on how you're looking at it. Like, you think if Naby Keita had come from a Premier League side, it'd probably cost a bit more, but it'd have been more used to the league. You'd be a bit more confident about what you're getting. And Liverpool have had to be a bit smarter now, I think, about what they're doing transfer-wise. Like, you think Gini Wijnaldum, when they signed him, it was after 1 year in the Premier League, 25 million. The players we're talking about here, if it was the fact that the market was in that state and you could get Tielemans or Kalvin Phillips for 25 million, you're happy with that. It's just the way the market has grown in these last few years. And if you want the player with the Premier League experience, they cost pretty much double that now. And it's one of those where it's so hard to buy English players. It's so hard to buy Premier League players. And that was the case before the pandemic. Never mind now where clubs don't have the money. You're going to have to just be either looking abroad for these players that you can sort of gamble on a little bit, or it's going to be the case of you waiting for the Premier League players to run out of contract and see if you can get them on the cheap or for free. Like with Leicester, if you wanted to look at Tielemans, I suppose one blessing there is they're going to have to replace Jamie Vardy at some point, and they're going to have to spend big to get a striker good enough to replace him. Granted, Kelechi Iheanacho's, I think I've got that name sort of right. He's done a great job for them second half of the season, but are you really relying on him to be your main striker? And Leicester have spent poorly on some players in the past, like Ios Perez. I think that was 35 million, and he's not really stepped up for them. You're looking at that squad. Tielemans is probably the one where they could get the big fee and then replace Vardy. And it's just all about timing now. Like the players we're talking about, they're at that age where if you want them, you need them now to get the best investment value for them. And the market is just not suitable for them at the moment. So it is going to be a case of for a few years, Liverpool probably going to have to shop abroad just because it's going to be cheaper. And while it might be a little bit of a gamble, at least then they've got more time with these players to develop them and see if Jurgen Klopp can work his magic again and turn these players into world-class performers, as he's done with Gini Wijnaldum, Mohamed Salah, Sadio Mane, and so many others.
Let's move on then to Florian Neuhaus, just to finish, Gorsty. I mean, I think his release clause has expired now, but you'd probably still be looking around 35, 40 million for him, given Borussia Monchengladbach missed out on the Champions League, the impact of the COVID pandemic to put into that as well. That kind of feels more like a Liverpool fee if they do go and sign a midfielder.
I think we've lost Gorsty, have we? Oh, he's there.
Yeah, I think. No. I thought we lost Matt. I was waiting for his question. Yeah, I do think that all the midfielders we've spoken about today, Youri, Tielemans, and Kalvin Phillips, I do think Florian Neuhaus does appear to be the more realistic Liverpool signing. I think I haven't seen too much of him. I've got to be honest. Didn't exactly watch Borussia Monchengladbach fairly regularly last season. But Germany international, I think there'll be quite a few eyes on him in the Euros now, won't there, with Liverpool fans looking to kind of catch a glimpse of what he might be about. As we've said, I mean, Liverpool are kind of privately stressing that they're not initially looking for like Wijnaldum replacement, but I just think there's just that much, the weight of kind of how much it makes sense for them to be looking at someone is kind of that far outweighs the idea that they're not going to be bringing in someone, I think. So, Neuhaus certainly someone to keep an eye on. He looks tall, big frame, powerful, not scared of putting the tackle in, gets about the pitch, scores quite a few goals from what I've seen. I was actually looking at the dreaded YouTube clips of him this morning, and they can probably make me look half decent, but he does seem to be someone who scores quite a few goals from the edge of the box, arriving late, and 1 or 2 goals from near the halfway line as well, which fans of Xabi Alonso will know go down well at Anfield. So look, he's someone who we're going to be keeping an eye on, isn't he, over the next 2 or 3 weeks. So I do think that Liverpool are kind of in the market for the central midfielder, despite what we're hearing at the moment.
Yeah, 8 goals I think it was for him in all competitions last season from midfield, which is not a bad return at all. I actually spoke to Florian Plettenberg, the chief football reporter at German outlet Sport 1 over the weekend for a special Florian Neuhaus podcast. He knows far more about him than any of us do, so if you do want to learn more about Florian Neuhaus, you can go and listen to that wherever you got this podcast from. But I think, Joe, the main things that I got from that podcast really was that he seems to be press resistant. He seems to be good at winning the ball back. He adds goals. He kind of sounds a little bit like a younger version of Gini Wijnaldum, which I suppose for Liverpool, if they do have a plan, trying to replicate Wijnaldum but a few years younger probably isn't a bad idea.
Yeah, and I think that would have been part of Liverpool's thinking when they didn't give him a contract, isn't it? They would have thought, well, do we want to go out and spend this money that would be giving Wijnaldum in wages on Wijnaldum as he gets into his 30s, or do we invest it on a younger version who, in theory, replaces him for years to come? So, but the one thing I find interesting about this player is that if his clause has expired, it's a very un-Liverpool thing to do, isn't it? Usually Liverpool go out and use a clause, or they would sort of have those connections. So, I'd find it odd if Liverpool then paid 40 million for a player who they could have got for 5-10 million cheaper not so long ago. When was that meant to have expired, that clause? Recently?
I think it was the end of last season, but the sort of talk in Germany, the idea is that the clause was almost like a gentleman's agreement. So it was a kind of, if someone puts that money on the table, they would have to consider it. So it probably wouldn't be massively different if Liverpool were to put the same money on the table even after the clause. It probably would be about the same, I think.
Oh, I see. Because you look at Konate and the way they use that clause. Obviously, they use Minamino's clause there. I think Liverpool, are quite good at using these sorts of things to their advantage. So, I think a lot makes sense about him. So, if I was going to put money on Liverpool signing a player out of the ones we've discussed, it would certainly be him.
Yeah, certainly. I'm sure if he does get on the pitch for Germany in the next few nights, I think they play on Tuesday, don't they, Germany? So I'm sure there'll be a fair few Liverpool fans tuning in. But, I mean, Theo, you look at the German options in that midfield, Toni Kroos, Ilkay Gundogan, Leon Goretzka. We might not even see him on the pitch, Neuhaus, because there's a fair few options in there.
Emre Can,
yeah. Hopefully he gets on the pitch ahead of him.
Yeah, Germany have always been blessed with this plethora of midfield options, and it's one where they've got so many aging stars, but it's almost like Liverpool there, isn't it? That you say these players that have been around at the top of the game for years now, there is going to be a change in the guard there. And even if Neuhaus isn't going to be a starring player at Euro 2020, probably will be in Qatar at the World Cup, Euro 2024, and then it's just who wants to snap him up now. Out of the 3 players we've discussed, he does seem most Liverpool-like signing. But then would it be a surprise at all if Liverpool went out and bought someone completely different? But if they do want to sign a midfielder, you'd imagine it's going to be towards the end of the window. Definitely going to be after the Euros are out the way. Because you think, well, the transfer business that they've done, they needed a centre-back desperately. That was the first one they've gone and got. And you're talking about priorities and the rest of the squad. Probably going to be a striker, isn't it? Like, you've got Jota to come in off the left. You've got Shaqiri, if he goes, Harvey Elliott can replace him as that Salah understudy. You need someone to be that alternative to Roberto Firmino. And midfield options, it's not a priority there in the sense of what else they need to do. It's going to be a case of, can you sell Origi? Can you sell Shaqiri? What are you doing with Minamino? And all these other players that you've got question marks over the futures, even Naby Keita or Alex Oxlade-Chamberlain. and then reassess the position come August, come the end of the transfer market, come the end of the transfer window, and see what out's there. See if these players having good Euros are desperate to move, want to make it in the Premier League, want to sign for Liverpool, and just go from there. That's one with Neuhaus. Well, if this clause has expired and he has a good Euros, like the players have mentioned, his value is just going to go up and up. So it's whether Liverpool want to take that sting now and just get him now and make a little bit of a gamble, or want to just see the best options. We know in the past they're always very astute when they weigh up who they move for. They weigh them all up against each other, see which one makes the most financial sense, which one's the best investment. It was very clear when they were moving for Tsimikas last season, for example, when they turned away from Jamal Lewis. Whoever they go for this summer, if they do go for midfielder, you'd expect similar again from them.
Yeah, certainly plenty to think about as Euro 2020 plays out. By the time you're listening to this show, Andy Robertson will have been in action. Thiago Alcantara could feature for Spain tonight against Sweden. And Diogo Jota's Portugal take on Hungary tomorrow night as well. All of the updates on those players to come over the next few days, but that's all we have time for on this edition of the Blood Red Podcast. From myself, Matt Addison, Paul Gorst, Joe Rimmer and Theo Squires. Thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and see you next time.
This is the Blood Red Podcast from the Liverpool